Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Truth is Justice. Thanks for joining us. Last week we played for you the police interviews of Herman Melgar, his wife Maria Melgar, and their daughter Marissa. These interviews were conducted just hours after Herman and Maria had arrived at 9538 Kelsey Meadows Court and discovered Jim murdered and Sandra bound in the closet. Herman and Maria's interviews were conducted in Spanish, and we provided links to the translations of those interviews in the show notes. We also provided links to the transcripts of the trial testimony of Herman and Maria during Sandra's trial in 2017. We've also put up the translation of Herman and Maria's discussions with Bob, which were played on episode 5 of his show. Thank you very much to Atty for the work she's done on that. If you haven't already, we encourage you to have a read through that material, even just to skim through it if you don't have a lot of time, just to familiarise yourself with the way Herman and Maria reflect on that night. The material provides a fantastic insight into how Herman and Maria's memories of that evening seem to have developed, and in some ways have been adapted over the years. The material also gives a great insight into the value of the interviews conducted that evening by Deputy Garcia and why, at least in my opinion, the suggestions by Bob that the right questions weren't asked is entirely incorrect. I believe Deputy Garcia's interviews with Herman and Maria that evening were thorough, they included all the right questions, and he had a high level of patience and persistence in ensuring that the information provided by Herman and Maria was accurate and that it was clearly conveyed. Now we are going to continue with our progression through the material, and this week we are considering the follow-up episode to episode 5 that Bob released. Now Bob describes his interviews with Herman and Maria, which were conducted over 2,000 days after the night of Jim's murder, as being, and to use Bob's words, some definite game changers. Now Bob supports that grandiose statement by referring to elements of Herman and Maria's memories from that evening, and by the suggestion that somehow and for some reason he was the right person to be asking the right questions. Now in this episode we will demonstrate to you why that simply isn't the case. In response to a listener question about possible inconsistencies in a timeline that Bob had provided of the evening when Herman and Maria arrived at the home, Bob begins the follow-up episode by asking his audience to consider the scenario that greeted Herman and Maria that evening. And he describes the environment as being one where chaos has broken loose, an environment that is scary, and a situation where all the events have happened within a minute or two. And Bob then proceeds through a very quick summary of the events, and quick both in terms of the actual events that he rattles off, and quick in terms of the speed of his speech, to try and demonstrate the rapid sequence of events that took place. I actually think that Bob makes a pretty good point here, particularly regarding the nature of the events and the time frame within which it occurred. But once again, this is a pattern that occurs over and over again, and not just in this season, and this case with the murder of Jim, but across other seasons of his show. The problem is the constant inconsistent application of a way of thinking that really lets the show down, and I'll explain why that statement is true in this context. I entirely agree that the environment inside the home that night would have been chaotic. It most definitely would have been intimidating and likely quite scary. I also agree that all the events after Herman and Maria's arrival at the home would have passed by very quickly. I believe that under those circumstances, most people would make certain decisions spontaneously and without considerable thought or periods of contemplation. Your senses would be heightened, but unlike the fictional character Sherlock Holmes, who applies a supremely refined level of deductive and inductive reasoning to particular stressful situations, most people will act in an instinctive way, and they will not have a great regard for committing specific details to memory. And that is what I believe the evidence demonstrates here. And it's why Deputy Garcia's interviews with Herman and Maria were so valuable. From the perspective of a reasonable person, the events described by Herman and Maria during those interviews suggested exactly the type of scenario you would consider, one which was stressful and threatening. They described the events as any reasonable person would likely describe them in that same situation. Just the right amount of details, just the right amount of recollection of specific elements, and a suggestion of all the events happening very quickly. The problem, as I see it, with Bob's approach, is that one can't describe a scene as chaotic and stressful and scary and all happening at a rapid pace, but then at the same time suggest that specific details were committed to memory. Not just short-term memory, but long-term memory, over 2,000 days after the events. And that at the same time as it all happening quickly, he suggests that there seemed to be considerable time at different points for contemplation and consideration of certain elements. And that's where the inconsistencies are. Now, as we progress through this episode, we will highlight a number of differences between Herman and Maria's statements made on that evening during their interviews with Deputy Garcia, and during their testimony at Sandra's trial, and then again during the recent interviews with Bob. Now, to be clear, we're not in any way suggesting that the statements made by Herman and Maria have been intentionally or in any way consciously adapted to fit a given narrative or a given theory. We're suggesting that memories change over time and that they're highly susceptible to modification. Bob himself has even discussed this concept very early on in his show whilst discussing the Adnan Syed case. And we heard Susan Simpson give a great explanation of this on the early episodes of Serial. Memories are very much like playing the children's game of whispering a message into the ear of the person next to you and waiting for that message to pass through many people before ending up back with you. The original message will likely have changed, and sometimes significantly so. Our memories can be impacted on in the same way. Now, it's entirely in conflict to say that a person's memory can be both easily modified and the accuracy of it degrades over time, yet somehow that same memory can be strengthened over time and heightened in its accuracy, yet that's exactly what Bob is suggesting. Those of you that have read the material I discussed earlier in the episode will have a good idea of some of the elements that changed significantly in Herman and Maria's recollection of that evening, and we will raise those as we progress through this episode. Now, at about the 7.5 minute mark, Bob is asked a question by a listener about the side gate leading to the backyard, and the relevance of whether it is locked or unlocked. The quick point I want to make here is that Bob's response is something that stood out to me. Now, Bob reflects on how all the houses in the street have fences, and then he goes on to say, and to quote Bob, and most of them, I would assume, would have secured gates to the backyard. Now, that statement stood out to me because it makes an assumption about a very significant element of his narrative, the theory that intruders broke into the Melgar home. Now, consider different assumptions in that context. What if we said that every house in the street, except the Melgar's home, didn't have a latch on the gate? What if all the other gates were simply spring-closed or tilted in such a way that they closed easily? Now, that very assumption, it completely changes the context of the narrative, and it is no more or less valid than the very assumption that Bob has made. Now, at about the 8.5 minute mark, Bob talks briefly about the trial testimony of Herman, and specifically he notes how Herman performed a demonstration during the trial of how the arm bindings were applied to Sandra when she was discovered. Now, this is significant, and it requires us to refer to the interviews conducted with Deputy Garcia, and to refer to the trial transcripts, and to refer to Bob's interview with Herman. Referring first to the interview conducted by Deputy Garcia with Herman on the evening of the 23rd of December 2012. And Deputy Garcia asks Herman to describe what happened and what he saw, and Herman notes how upon opening the bathroom closet door he found Sandra tied by her feet and her hands. He goes on to describe how he untied the knots she had around her hands and notes that the hands were tied behind her back. A short time later in the interview, Herman states again that Sandra's hands were tied behind her back and stating that her arms were towards her back. In total, during the interview, Herman goes on to state 8 times that Sandra's hands, specifically her hands, he doesn't refer to arms, were tied behind her back. He does describe Sandra's arms on one occasion, when describing how the bindings were applied, by saying that Sandra's arms were towards the back. Not crossed over, not twisted, not bent at 90 degrees, but just towards the back. And to remind you again, this is Herman's direct verbal account of the positioning of Sandra's arms from his perspective, given just hours after he discovered Sandra. By contrast, the descriptions given by Herman at trial were very different, and this is where the language relating to hands disappears from Herman's recollection, and the words arms and wrists play a more prominent role. Now, we'll compare that again with Bob's interview, which again was conducted over 2,000 days after the event. The term hands has again disappeared, and the term arms now plays a prominent role. And Bob does note that Herman performs a demonstration of how he recalls Sandra being restrained. Herman apparently lay down on the floor with his arms behind his back. Now, it's in this interview where we hear for the first time on record that the bindings on Sandra's arms resembled a bandage in the way that they were wrapped. And Bob goes on to state that Herman indicated, by demonstrating on Bob's arms, that Sandra's arms were bent at a 90-degree angle behind her back, with her forearms parallel to each other. The narration that Bob provides indicates that the bindings were wrapped around several times, extending from elbow to elbow, and it's described that they were like stripes on a candy cane. Now you can see the way the recollection evolved, and the changing terms which were used. Is that due to a memory that has improved dramatically over time with respect to an accurate recall of the specifics of arm positioning and wrapping of the binding, or is it something that has evolved in some other way? Now, Bob finishes Herman's interview with another narration where he makes the statement that things may have turned out differently, and to quote Bob, if the police had ever asked Herman how she was bound. If you haven't read the interview with Herman, I strongly encourage you again to have a read through it. Or if you speak Spanish, listen to it. Deputy Garcia allows Herman to describe the way Sandra was bound. Not once, not twice, but specifically referring to how she was tied 8 separate times. Deputy Garcia didn't stop Herman from talking. He didn't suggest anything, he didn't offer up words, he didn't provide actions to influence a particular outcome. He simply asked the right questions to get good, accurate responses. At about the 9-minute mark, Bob begins to talk further about Herman's testimony and makes some quite startling observations about the mindset of the prosecutor, Ms. Barnett's reasons for not cross-examining Herman. I say startling because I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do with any confidence to determine the motivations of another individual, especially in a highly complex situation such as the prosecution of a criminal murder trial and the examination of a witness. I've witnessed many trials, and I could not say with any degree of certainty what the mindset of a specific member of the defence or prosecution teams was with respect to their decision of whether to cross-examine a witness. Now, Bob goes even further in making the following statement, and to quote Bob, "That also goes to show how disinterested the prosecution was in finding out what actually happened." Bob then notes how Herman's testimony is completely contradictory to what Ms. Barnett is telling the jury. Interestingly, and it's very, very telling, during this response and these renewed attacks on Ms. Barnett, Bob makes absolutely no mention of Maria's testimony at trial, or her lengthy cross-examination and re-cross-examination by Ms. Barnett. Nothing. There's not a word. And there's a very good reason for that. Maria's testimony was contradictory in certain important respects with regards to Herman's testimony, and it supported what Ms. Barnett explained to the jury. And to explain that statement a little bit further, we'll go back to the interviews with Deputy Garcia, to the trial testimony, and to Bob's interviews, and this time we'll look at it from a broader perspective, with respect to how Sandra's bindings were applied, who saw them, and who individually released them. Now, during Herman's interview with Deputy Garcia, he describes how he released the bindings fully from Sandra's hands, with the scissors which Sandra had directed him to. Now, he doesn't just make mention of completing this process fully himself once. Deputy Garcia asks him to confirm this, and Herman does confirm it. So to be clear, Herman confirms during the interview, which was made just hours after discovering Sandra in the closet, that he, and he alone, removed the bindings from Sandra's arms. Now, this doesn't appear to be a failure of translation or anything similar, because Herman goes on to describe how he took the cut bindings off and left them there on the floor. He goes even further in stating that he removed them fast, and that's exactly what you would expect in such a high-stress situation where the ultimate goal, the top priority, was to free Sandra from the restraints. Herman then notes that Maria arrived at the closet door, and he passed the scissors to her to free Sandra's feet bindings. Now, consistent with that account, during Maria's interview with Deputy Garcia, she notes how she was not aware of whether Sandra even had bindings on her hands. She recalls how the first time she saw Sandra, she noticed that her feet were bound. Maria goes on to mention how Sandra's feet were bound 5 separate times during the interview, but she doesn't make mention once of Sandra's hands, arms, or her wrists being bound. Maria describes the colourful scarf used to bind Sandra's feet, that's the blue and green scarf, and she notes how she used the scissors passed to her by Herman to cut the scarf to release Sandra. Now, Deputy Garcia specifically asks about Sandra's hands being bound, and Maria notes that she wouldn't know, that would need to be a question asked of Herman, because when she first saw Sandra, only her feet were bound. So to be clear again, just hours after cutting free Sandra's feet restraints, Maria has no memory whatsoever of even observing ties on Sandra's hands, arms, or wrists, let alone being involved in any way in the process of cutting them. She has a clear memory of cutting the feet binding, and she can even describe the scarf that was used in that binding, describing the colour of it, but she makes a clear statement about not observing the hand bindings. Now at trial, the recollection from Herman's perspective is somewhat different in this respect. Now, Herman describes how he tried to untie the bindings around Sandra's arms, but he states that they were very well tied. He notes how he was able to begin to release the arm bindings by making 2 cuts with the scissors directly to the bindings, and how he then passed the scissors to Maria for her to finish untying Sandra. Now, it's also worth noting that with respect to the chair, Herman notes that upon observing the chair blocking the door, he, and to quote directly from the translation of Herman, immediately removed the chair. Now at trial, Maria had a somewhat different perspective to Herman. She notes how she saw Herman trying to untie Sandra, but that he was unable to complete the process, and she grabbed the scissors from him and finished cutting off the arm bindings and then proceeded to cut the feet bindings. Under cross-examination by Ms. Barnett, Maria is asked about the blue-green scarf. A scarf which, hours after the discovery of Sandra, she tells Deputy Garcia that she removed from Sandra's feet. Initially, Maria notes that it is her memory that the blue-green scarf was wrapped around Sandra's wrists, and Maria uses that word, wrists. And several questions later, Maria describes how Sandra was restrained by a scarf and cords on her ankles, and a scarf and cords on her hands. Now, she's asked by Miss Barnett whether she is absolutely sure about that recollection, and Maria confirms that she is. And further in cross-examination, Ms. Barnett asks Maria about the pillow sham. She presents Maria with the state's exhibit of the pillow sham and asks Maria whether she can recall seeing it anywhere in the bathroom. Maria states she can't recall seeing it anywhere, and when prompted, notes that she doesn't believe the pillow sham was there at all. During re-cross-examination, Ms. Barnett asks Maria about the specific nature of how Sandra's arms were restrained. Maria is asked to perform a demonstration for the jury, which she does. Maria's demonstration is very interesting. Maria places her hands together behind her back, and it's worth stating this again. Maria states that Sandra's bindings were such that her hands were together, effectively clasping each other. Now that description from Maria would obviously make it completely impossible for the arms to be restrained at a 90-degree angle. Now a final point with respect to Maria's trial testimony, and with respect to the chair. Now, in response to a question about how difficult it was for Herman to release the chair, Maria notes that it was hard for him to release the chair, and that she left him to do that while she looked in other parts of the house for Jim. You recall that it is in contrast to Herman's statement that he removed the chair immediately, and that was Herman's words. Now, we'll see how the recollections change during Herman and Maria's interviews with Bob. This is where it gets very interesting. Now, Herman describes to Bob how he helped Sandra sit up so that he could inspect the bindings to find the knot. He states that he was unable to find the knot anywhere. It's worth noting that this is the first time that we have heard on record that Sandra was sat up before being released from either of her restraints, and would appear to be inconsistent with Maria's recollection about her first sighting of Sandra and Sandra's body position at that time. Now, Herman goes on to note that after gathering the scissors, he was able to make 2 or 3 cuts to the bindings, but that Sandra remained restrained. He notes that he then gave the scissors to Maria for her to finish cutting the bindings off Sandra's arms. With respect to the release of the arm bindings, Maria provides a similar description to Bob to the one that she provided during the trial. She notes how Herman passed her the scissors and asked her to finish untying Sandra by using the scissors. Bob asks Maria the question whether, when she started helping Sandra, were Sandra's arms still tied up, and Maria confirms to Bob that they were, and she notes that her arms were still crossed. Maria notes how she cut the bindings in a way that allowed her to untie Sandra's arms, and that she was then able to cut and free the bindings from Sandra's feet. Bob then asked Maria to demonstrate the way Sandra's arms were restrained, and in the notations Bob describes how Maria performed a demonstration which was the same as Herman's, both arms bent at 90 degrees behind her back with her forearms parallel to each other. Now, something worth noting, you'll notice how both Herman and Maria both performed demonstrations of their arms being restrained behind their backs. You may also remember the number of times, the number of people that Bob has claimed are simply unable to perform that demonstration. Himself and his wife Becky come to mind immediately. It's just something that seems odd to me. Herman and Maria are both able to do the demonstrations willingly and on command multiple times. Yet in the weeks following, there's suggestions by Bob and by others and on the various Facebook groups that the mere movement of the arms in that way for a lot of people is almost impossible, or at least damagingly painful. And clearly I don't agree with that contention in any way. You will have seen during these descriptions that the memories from that evening have changed substantially between hours after the incident to 2,000 plus days later. And that is what memories do, they change. And that is why, for most people, your ability to recall an event is at the peak level of accuracy a short time after the event happens. Going back to Bob's original statement at the 9.5-minute mark that led to us considering the police interviews, the trial testimony and Bob's interviews. For Bob to state that Ms. Barnett was somehow contradicted in what she told the jury is not only false, it completely misrepresents what happened. Now that you've been able to hear the testimony from Maria and compare the ways in which the memories of Herman and Maria have changed over time, you'll understand exactly why Bob didn't bring up Maria's testimony at the trial, or ask her or Herman any questions about their police interviews taken just hours after they discovered Sandra restrained in the closet. It simply doesn't fit his narrative. It doesn't fit the story or the image that Bob wants to present, so the facts are simply ignored and they're just not released to the audience. Now, of course, you can decide to ignore elements of the case, and that's what we're finding so often happens with respect to the analysis that Bob conducts. And yeah, that allows you to present an entertaining show and to go on the attack against individuals, etc. But it doesn't lead you to the truth. All it does is create a work of fiction, with a few hand-picked pieces of evidence thrown in to satisfy acceptance in the genre of true crime. Fortunately, the justice system isn't that way. You can't pick and choose which evidence is incorporated into a trial. You can't ignore the evidence that points to guilt and only have the evidence presented to a jury that points to innocence. Now, at about the 11-minute mark, we hear Bob begin to raise questions about the work of Mr. Carpenter. It's brief and it's subtle, and it relates to Bob's assertion that no crime scene photographs were taken of a source of light that Gerson Melgar describes as coming from inside the home. Now, you'll hear us talk a little bit about that again over the coming weeks. You'll recall me raising on a number of occasions on previous episodes how Bob has stated that the state's case revolved around 2 elements. And those 2 elements have changed multiple times, depending on what suits Bob's narrative and what his argument is at the time. At the 12-minute mark, we have yet another change to what Bob considers to be the state's case. Firstly, that Sandra's story doesn't make sense, and secondly, that the alternate scenario doesn't make sense. Bob also takes the opportunity again to question why the prosecution wouldn't take every opportunity to get as much information as possible. Conveniently, and absolutely necessarily from Bob's perspective, again he leaves out the cross-examination and recross of Maria Melgar. At approximately the 13.5 minute mark, Bob describes how the interviews conducted by Deputy Garcia didn't go into any details. Now again, read the transcripts, or if you can speak Spanish, listen to the audio. This is just another entirely false claim that Bob relies on his audience not following up on and taking him at his word. Now at about the 23 minute mark, Bob talks about the bindings and how tight they were. And he notes multiple times how tight the bindings must have been, and he gives a few examples as to why it would have been necessary for them to be extremely tight. I just wanted to mention that, and we'll come back to that point in coming weeks because it has some important implications. At about the 26.5 minute mark, Bob notes that the binding used to restrain Sandra's arms was not stretchy. Now, he doesn't give any justification for that statement. He simply notes that it doesn't look to him like it is stretchy. Again, this is important because it goes on to become something that his audience accepts as fact, and that Bob himself incorporates into explanations about how Sandra could not have possibly self-restrained. And we'll talk about that more in coming weeks. But briefly, the material that was used to bind Sandra's arms was stretchy. In fact, it was significantly stretchy. And that's not a guess. That's information that's come directly from members of the jury that had the opportunity to actually feel the material. At about the 29.5 minute mark, Bob talks about Sandra's arm restraints, and specifically his discussions with Ms. Barnett about what Bob suggests is her description of how Sandra was restrained. Now, Bob describes a restraint which is applied at the wrists, and goes on to explain again Herman's testimony. But once again, the thing he doesn't do is mention Maria's testimony, where she described exactly what Bob is suggesting was a misrepresentation by Ms. Barnett. This is nothing more, again, than a method to attack the credibility of Miss Barnett through a statement Bob makes that was entirely false. It was done, again, quite simply through ignoring large elements of the evidence, in this instance, Maria's trial testimony. Now, to finish up this week's episode, Bob answers a question where a follower notes that the police described Sandra as being emotionless. And Bob talks about how he hates seeing comments made like that by the police. And he goes on to describe how it's connected with confirmation bias. This is another interesting comment and something else that we'll be coming back to in the coming weeks. Because whilst Bob is quite comfortable attacking others for making judgments on demeanour, etc., he appears to have no issues with applying the same approach or supporting those that apply the same approach, particularly when it's convenient. And that concludes this week's episode. Thank you again for listening. If you haven't already joined the Truth is Justice Facebook group, we strongly encourage you to do so. There are some excellent discussions taking place with some quite extraordinary analysis being undertaken by some of the members there. And we look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice as we continue to set the record straight.
Thank you.